Hail and well met, Slayers of Giants. I know a lot of you came here through the Brickgate saga. Welcome. This is a big week in the progress of the case, and I think it's helped me produce one of the best chapters of this book so far. Silver lining to a bad situation, right? If you're just joining us for the novel for the first time, you are in for a trip. A short recap. The story starts when the fictional character, Benjamin, has a break with reality because he's been so beaten down by, among other things, being left destitute after the theft of his life savings by a corporation called MegaCorp. He invents a Don Quixote-esque knight-errant who is traveling around righting wrongs. Only unlike Don Quixote, who is crazy, Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona is sane and correct about living in a world of hidden magic, and he's come to the United States to figure out why this land is cursed. Rolando has taken on a squire, Serge Sanchez, and when Serge was knighted by the goddess of Lake Erie, so now he's Sir Sanchez of the town of Eels, guardian of justice and protector of mermaids, he got a familiar like Rolando, only Rolando's is a raven and Serge's familiar is a red panda. They befriended a woman named Callie on their journey, who turned out to be a Selkie mermaid hybrid, and she reappeared with Sir Steezel and his familiar, the billy goat Reckless Ken, to rescue Rolando and Serge from a group of monsters. The four knights and their three familiars traveled to Chicago to attend a meeting of the spirits of the Great Lakes, and Callie was knighted Dame Callie the Lion-Hearted of Santa Leon, defender of the underestimated. The spirits told them to come back to Portland to get armor for Serge and Callie at an office just down the street from where Benjamin, the character, lives, at the headquarters of the Under Armour Corporation. And there they met an orc who ran a forge on top of the building, and he made magical armor for Serge and Callie. Then they all went back to Michigan, braved an enchanted forest that tried to kill them, found the witch, Harrietta Galbraith, and she promised to take them to New Orleans to introduce them to someone who could tell them where to find the evil wizard Fenkum. And that's where we left off last week. Before I begin reading Chapter 26, thank you all for the overwhelming support as we battle a corporation that made it clear they want to make our lives Whether you're a commenter, a GoFundMe donor, or a person who told a friend, "Have you heard about this Brickgate thing?" Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. A special thanks to illustrator Cyan and author Hydra Corvey, illustrators of the book The Upside Down Sea. They're the sponsors of this week's show. More on that book later. Okay, back to our story. And, as I remind everyone each week, this is just a draft. It can still be changed before it gets compiled into a novel you'll be able to hold in your hands. So if you notice anything, a typo in the text on my Patreon or Substack, a continuity error, a huge structural change you'd recommend, I appreciate any and all feedback, even if I don't always agree with it. So put that in the comments wherever you're finding this, and I'll wrangle all those notes into my document that I use as I edit the final version. Here's Brick by Brick, Chapter 26. The Morons of MegaCorp. The bomb Benjamin and Chris's lawyer referenced took the form of a legal filing, an amendment to their initial lawsuit with more details about the demands based on the harms the couple had incurred as a consequence of the conversion of their store and all its assets, the defamation MegaCorp had engaged in once the case became public, and the punitive damages the couple sought to use to teach MegaCorp their pattern of behavior would need to change because it was no longer profitable. Benjamin felt he was learning about the law in the same way he learned about the inner workings of his car's engine. When he didn't have a legal dispute, he didn't need to know much more than what legal dramas required him to understand to get to the climax of an hour-long episode. When his own car had issues, he suddenly learned about parts he didn't even know about before. He couldn't have said what an alternator did until his didn't. Similarly, he was now learning about the distinction between conversion and theft, about slap laws, about state versus federal court systems, about civil RICO statutes, and more. Some online fans of the case joked watching the scandal unfold had given them law degrees, but Benjamin felt keenly aware he was still a guy standing over the open engine compartment, nodding and pretending to understand half of what he was being told about the machine in front of him. Gas. Spark, controlled explosion, piston moves, turns crank, gears make wheels move, brakes keep wheels from moving when they aren't supposed to. Later inventions are nice additions, like shocks and a windshield, but the former are the essentials. Benjamin understood the law in a similar amateur way. While Benjamin liked the idea of a prompt resolution of the case, he looked forward to the next unit in this public amateur law school curriculum that would come about during the discovery process. If MegaCorp had to admit to some of their most public lies on paper and under penalty of perjury, that alone wouldn't provide Benjamin and Chris with any financial recompense. But it would humiliate the corporation in a way that would be a small comfort to the couple the corporation had bullied. MegaCorp had such confidence in the impunity they could purchase through the sheer weight of the legal team they could afford to amass. With 3 lawyers or 10, with the fanciest office building money could buy, business cards printed on whatever composite of foreign paper, silk, and gold they could wave around, MegaCorp could not afford to build a time machine and hire lawyers who would go back and advise them to follow the goddamn law before they broke it, create the necessary documentation in the past, and avoid making spurious claims on TV interviews and in their public press releases. Benjamin and Chris might only have been able to hire a single attorney, but she could demand MegaCorp reveal all the ways they lied and cheated, or admit they didn't possess the kind of documentation any responsible business would have retained to defend themselves, a defense of incompetence that might be worse for them than an admission of culpability. Considering Benjamin and Chris's tenuous financial position, he shouldn't have been so concerned about the corporation's comeuppance. Schadenfreude may feel good, but it's not edible, nor can it be exchanged for rent. Benjamin felt the pressure from the online community to hold the line so everyone could see the document drops. He also understood an NDA and a settlement agreement might allow MegaCorp to go on hurting others in the same way they'd done to Chris and Benjamin. He could justify his desire for their comeuppance on the grounds that he wanted justice and hoped to prevent future harm to others. But some of this was pure glee at the thought of the notion of bullies brought low. He felt guilt about the juvenile origin of his motivation, and yet... As their lawyers' filing appeared, and as show after show poured over it and ridiculed MegaCorp for their unethical initial behavior, then their ham-fisted response to the public scandal they'd caused, Benjamin liked to imagine the goings-on in the C-suite at MegaCorp headquarters. Were the CEO and CFO shouting at one another, swiping all the papers off of desks, throwing paperweights at the walls? Was some accountant sitting in the break room, listening to the men puffing up their chests and threatening to punch one another, while her tears fell into her Tupperware container of grocery store sushi? Did the very sales rep who'd been tasked with managing what the company had labeled the hostile takeover of Chris and Benjamin's store now sit in the dark in his cubicle after hours, illuminated only by the glow of his monitor, nodding his fingers in his short hair as he watched video after video of his bosses calling him a low-level employee who had botched the entire affair by doing exactly what they'd ordered him to do? Benjamin remembered the striking sexism manifested in the disparate treatment that particular guy had demonstrated when talking first with Chris, then with him on the night MegaCorp had taken their store. Did the executive projects manager / low-level employee see his sexism coming to light and feel guilty? Or did he curse the woman who dared to record the conversation and broadcast it to the world? And what about the other 2 franchisees who'd pretended not to know what they were stealing, then revealed they had been ordered to do so by MegaCorp's CEO while secretly working as contractors for corporate? Did they worry about the police knocking on the door, asking for them by name, and informing them the case had finally received enough public attention that the local DA had decided it ought to be treated as felony grand larceny instead of just conversion? Benjamin knew that kind of dread. He'd received death threats for his political activism during the summer of George Floyd, and he'd wondered when some MAGA nutjob would follow through. His stalkers had sent him pictures of his own house, maps of his son's route to school, images of blurred white supremacists pointing pistols at the camera, graphic descriptions of his murder for daring to hold a sign expressing the thesis that black people shouldn't be subject to extrajudicial murder by police, but summarized in 3 words. Later, while living in Spain, Benjamin knew what it was like to stare at the ceiling and know he'd soon be homeless. He didn't want to wish that kind of fear on anyone. But if his imagination was determined to run wild, the crooks at MegaCorp were the most deserving exceptions he could think of. He decided even this kind of fantasizing was unhealthy. Remembering debates in his undergrad philosophy courses, he still leaned toward Aristotle's conception of self-improvement over Plato's. Goodness was not some abstraction which, once known, controlled behavior. Goodness is a practice, and one could pretend to be good until they truly were by habit. So he shook the images of the MegaCorp executives' meltdowns from his mind, leashed his dogs, and took the pooches for a nice walk in Portland's waterfront park. If everything went perfectly, he reminded himself, with a jury trial, full discovery revealing all MegaCorp's crimes, some significant judgment that made up for all the harm, all the pain, all the loss, and, miracle upon miracles, no NDA to prevent Benjamin from telling the world his story, at the end of it all, after years of struggle, he would still just be a man holding 3 leashes in the park. He'd be wearing the same clothes, though he'd certainly replace his current boots with a new pair of the same brand and design, just without the broken zipper one of the dogs had chewed. There still wouldn't be cash in his wallet, and the amount of money in his bank accounts wouldn't change the physical properties of his credit card. There, in the park, he'd be the same person, perhaps with slightly lower blood pressure, and with different worries rolling around in his head. So why spend energy imagining the misery of his enemies when he could enjoy the pleasure of watching the happy dogs rediscovering the park they'd largely forgotten since the day before, but now vaguely recalled enjoying almost as much as they were enjoying it today? The puppies, the 2 smaller dogs, who were not puppies but would always look like it next to their much larger adopted sibling, entertained themselves by keeping a keen eye out for threats, barking at bikers and joggers, being scolded by their owner, then forgetting their training and remembering the pride they felt at being such good protectors. Their larger brother loved the space to stretch his legs, the smell of the grass, the sense of every other potential friend who'd peed on a tree, the geese who may be mortal enemies and may be meals. Sure, beyond these joys, he felt afraid of everything. Every human was a danger, especially the ones who moved too quickly on skateboards or scooters or little toddler legs. If the puppies weren't allowed to protect him with their barking, at least he could put as much distance between himself and a passerby as the leash would allow, until he realized that brought him nearer to another danger and dodged back the other way. Even the dog's most annoying foibles entertained Benjamin. He told himself this was enough, that any imagining of MegaCorp's reaction was unbecoming, and he put it out of his mind entirely. Meanwhile, at MegaCorp headquarters, things were worse than Benjamin could have possibly imagined, because Benjamin didn't know the silent partner, Fenkum, was an evil wizard. The CEO and CFO of MegaCorp also didn't know their primary shareholder was a wizard, of course. They were bad people by most measures, but merely human, and thus unwilling to see magic. Had they sought it, they would have recognized as supernatural the way Fenkum appeared at all the wrong times, would have seen through his glamours and recognized his robes and wand for what they were. Instead, when Fenkum showed up, they saw an older gentleman in khaki slacks, a golf shirt, and his ever-present New Balance sneakers, looking like a recently retired dentist who'd just come from a morning at the links. Because of their elected ignorance of magic, they couldn't accurately identify why they found the man so intimidating. They attributed it to his brilliance as a businessman and to his vast wealth, and to the common conflation that one causes the other. In fact, Fenkum was wealthy for the same reason that most rich people are rich: compound interest and regulatory capture by other rich people protecting their own class. The only difference, in his case, was that he hadn't been handed his wealth by a parent or other wealthy benefactor. He'd bootstrapped, in the sense that he'd lived for hundreds of years, and his money had grown while his fellow aristocrats had tricked poor, aspiring aristocrats into voting to protect his wealth at all costs. Fenkum had learned a management style which served him well, both in ingratiating him to his fellow plutocrats and in cowing subordinates. He never backed down, even when he was wrong. No, especially when he was wrong. A certain authoritarian mindset admires this characteristic and obeys those demonstrating it, like the proverbial lemmings looking for a fellow to chase off a Scandinavian fjord. Of course, real lemmings don't do this. A Disney documentary in 1958 used trick footage, creative camera angles, and real lemmings placed on a slippery turntable and spun off into their faked suicidal dives to trick a generation into believing the lie. Which really illustrates exactly the point they were making about lemmings, only not about lemmings. Just as Benjamin had imagined, the CEO and CFO of MegaCorp had been throwing simultaneous temper tantrums as they watched the news of the filing come in, and they had no patience for anyone knocking on the door while they shouted at one another. "We're completely screwed!" the CEO was shouting. His voice rose in a pinched squeal because he'd been taught only low-class people use swear words. "It's not my fault!" the CFO whined. I'm the one who kept saying we need to handle these people with more care when we do these takeovers. I told Billy to keep saying we were giving them grace to let them out of their contracts. Grace. I said that over and over. You heard that. And how well did that work? The CEO said. Billy said the word grace like 5 times. And nobody gives us any credit for being a kind, God-fearing company, do they? They just laugh at us for talking about grace in the middle of a hostile takeover. That's not my fault either, the CFO said. He'd been pacing, but now he plopped down in one of the 2 chairs facing the CEO's desk. They're Gentiles. What do you expect? They don't respect God-fearing people. And you telling that interviewer you think of people like output machines? How did you think that would go over? I didn't think about how it would go over with people because I was telling the truth, you idiot. I don't think of people as people. I think of them as output machines. Dealing with the people part is your job, darn it. Well, that's what got us into this. You just did the math on taking people's stores and selling them again and again. Sure, the math works, but the people get angry when we steal from them. Wasn't there ever a moment in your big plan where you had to deal with that part? What part? The CEO barked. Their feelings? No, I didn't account for those because they don't matter. If they can't get us in court, who cares how angry they are? But now their anger is getting us into court, the CFO shouted back. The CEO's voice dropped to a more ominous conversational tone. No, I would say that's not correct. Not correct at all. It's crowdfunding, not anger, that's getting them into court. If we could sue them for the proceeds of their crowdfunding, they wouldn't be able to afford to fight us anymore. Isn't that right? The lawyer, a young man named Richard, who preferred to go by Rich, who'd only been out of law school for a couple of years and who'd been assigned to deal with the MegaCorp brass because none of the partners or even assistant partners at his fancy white shoe firm had the patience for them, sat in a chair in the corner of the room, quietly pretending to take notes on a yellow legal pad. No, suing them will not keep you out of court. It will get you into court, which is what you've been trying to avoid. Yeah, but if the threat of the lawsuit is big enough, they'll go away, the CEO said. It's always worked before. That's why we pay you guys. People hear the Norden's name and run scared, right? You can only scare people for so long, Richard said. Then what are we paying you for, Dick? The CEO said. He loved calling Richard Dick because it provided an opportunity to say a bad word and also to keep the young lawyer in his place. You're paying me to give you advice, and you may choose to take that advice or to ignore it. You've been ignoring it. That's your right. Costs the same whether you take it or ignore it. Darn it, Dick! The CEO shouted. He scanned his desk and found he'd knocked everything off it already except for a pad of post-it notes. He picked up the pink cube of paper and hurled it back down on the mahogany surface with all his might. It made a cute little hiccup noise. Furious, he slapped the top of the desk with his meaty palm 5 times until the last made a sufficiently loud clap to express his anger. And by then, he'd forgotten why exactly he was angry with Rich. He wheeled on the CFO. You know whose fault this really is? Shoeless John. Shoeless John got his nickname from the fact that he took his shoes and socks off at every chance he could. He had a business partner everyone called Silent Brant. Silent Brant was not quite as silent as the movie character Silent Bob, but looked a bit like a taller, dumber version, and spoke slightly more while saying vastly less. Maybe, the CFO conceded, or maybe it was Silent Brant. He handled the hostile takeover along with Billy, but I'll bet he didn't use the word grace even once. Of course he didn't. He never says anything. He probably didn't have time because he was busy moving stock around, so it wouldn't show up in the pictures he was sending to us. You know he was stealing from us, don't you? The CEO and CFO had learned their hired goon was stealing from them when Chris's photographs had been shared publicly, but they couldn't easily tell the public the guy they'd sent to steal the store had skimmed some of the sets for himself. We were robbed while in the process of robbing didn't make for a great press release. You did tell Shoeless John they could have it for whatever they could get it for, and then you told Silent Brant to tell us what it was worth. Of course Shoeless John told Silent Brant to lowball it. You know how close they are. The CEO shook his head. Shoeless John wouldn't do that to me. We've been friends since our mission. You told me about what he did on that mission. The CFO did not describe the crimes because he didn't like to think about them, but he shivered. The guy has always been a crook. The CEO waved this away. Sure, but he got our back when we sued Dad. The CEO and CFO were brothers, though the CEO was quick to tell anyone who asked about their relationship that he didn't feel any closer to the CFO than to any of his other 6 siblings. This almost sounded like someone expressing love for the rest of the family, except he'd immediately follow it by saying they all felt like output machines to him, and that, well, he worked with his brother every day, the other 6 wouldn't speak to him, and they'd been giving him the silent treatment since he sued his father, who fired him. This additional explanation generally resulted in long silence from his interlocutor, especially when it was someone like the kid behind the counter at the movie theater who'd just said, "You guys look alike. Are you brothers?" Sometimes he would go further and explain that their father had been stealing from his own company, the one they used to work for, to pay for what the CEO called ladies of the night. Something that would have made the kid behind the counter even more uncomfortable if he'd had any inkling what the euphemism meant. This was true, but the CEO did not mention their father had fired them for embezzling money from his company to prop up the new one that would someday become MegaCorp, that their father had countersued them both, and they'd all settled to avoid the discovery process that would reveal both their father's corporation and their own new one had engaged in egregious tax fraud. The NDAs they'd signed at the end of that process had made it very clear they would never speak about any of this. But the CEO believed contractual obligations did not apply to him because he had more expensive attorneys, a notion he'd acquired from his father. "Shoeless John and Silent Brant sided with us because they didn't have any choice. Dad would never hire them, but you like hiring crooks." The CFO looked out the window into the parking lot wistfully. "I hope Billy doesn't end up involved in crimes. He's such a nice kid." "I hire people like Shoeless John and Silent Brant because they're tough. They will tell someone to fudge off, to just go fudge themselves, to say fudge you to anybody. And," the CEO raised a finger in the air and shook it to show just how important this last point would be, "they won't take no for an answer." In the corner, Rich mumbled, "That's the resume of a rapist who cosplays as Willy Wonka." He bit down on a smile, focused on his yellow legal pad, and made an obscene doodle of a caricature, without shoes but with a big top hat, and multiple speech bubbles that each said fudge. "Still," the CFO said, "there's got to be a way to pin all this on those 2, right?" "Oh, so now you want to show grace to the Gentiles, but not to our closest friends?" The CFO raised his hands. "Hey, I never wanted to show grace to anybody. I'm just the one who's sensitive to people's feelings, okay?" "Whatever," the CEO said. He swiped at the pad of Post-its that had refused to play its part correctly, hauled back and threw it like a baseball at the back of his office door. It made an unobliging, rubbery thunk. He started looking for something else to throw, then heard the pad of paper make 3 similar sounds, as though it was trying to redeem itself. So he was looking at the pink pad of paper on the floor, trying to understand how it had accomplished this feat, when his brother told the door, "Not a good time." This also didn't compute in the CEO's rage-addled brain. Which had timed the mysterious bonking poorly, the door or the Post-its, he wondered. Then Fenkum opened the door. He'd teleported from his lair in South Dakota, then knocked politely, but he refused to allow the CFO, one of the humans he respected least, to tell him to buzz off. He opened the door and ducked a bit so his black pointed brimless hat, which the humans couldn't see, wouldn't catch on the doorframe. As his familiar scurried past him into the room, he kicked at it just for fun. The puppy was also invisible to the humans. They couldn't hear its tiny claws tapping on the mess on the floor, and the CEO couldn't smell or feel it as it lifted a leg and pissed on his ankle. The men in the room couldn't see Fenkum's long black robe, just his golf shirt and khaki shorts, but his white sneakers with their distinct blue N were as visible as his large handlebar mustache and his monocle. His hair was slicked back with shoe polish, which hid the gray and kept his hair in perfect place under his invisible hat, a habit he'd picked up in the late 1800s. The CEO grew out a handlebar mustache because he admired the audacity his benefactor displayed in wearing something so obviously villainous without any sign of concern for the reaction it produced among his inferiors. Only the CEO's was short and ended in 2 wispy curls, while the wizard's was bushy and large and grew out into enormous thick curls well beyond the sides of his face. The CEO couldn't figure out how to justify a window glass monocle, and dyeing his red hair black seemed to cross the line between admiration and cosplay. Fenkum straightened as he entered the room, and shot each man a withering sneer. "Oh, should I wait and come back when you've made things even worse?" The CFO jumped up to a standing position. The CEO stopped looking for something to throw and started looking for papers he could stack in a neat pile to look officiously office-ish. His papers were all over the floor, so he seemed to be ignoring Fenkom's appearance completely. Fenkom put a hand out under the CEO's nose and snapped his fingers 3 times. His familiar, sensing his master's feelings, scrambled under the CEO's desk and dropped a transparent, glowing ghost turd the humans would never find. Fenkom noticed, approved, made a mental note to try to kick the dog for it later anyway, and then looked at the lawyer in the corner. Did his brain break? Rich shrugged and went on doodling. No, it's... The CEO rounded his desk, picked up his toppled chair, and sat heavily. It's a big, giant clusterfudge, sir. The CFO, still standing, nodded gravely. The woman who's suing us just filed an amendment to her complaint with a lot more details, and it makes us look really bad, sir. First things first, Fenkom said. Is my name in there? No, but... Good, Fenkom said. But, the CFO powered on, though it obviously pained him to do so. There's a mention of unnamed John Does, and it does list some of our LLCs that may connect them back to you. And the money. A decent forensic accountant will be able to track the money going back and forth, sir, Rich said from the corner. There's no real way to hide that if we get into discovery. Fenkom could think of a dozen ways. Glamours, magical disappearances, words rearranged on pages, whole documents printed on paper stamped with invisible words that would drive the reader insane. At present, he considered the possibility that if 3 grown men were to be discovered in an office, all having spontaneously combusted, the mystery of their mixed-up chunks might delay any investigation into MegaCorp's financial dealings until after his great curse had hatched. Of course, the young lawyer hadn't learned about the wizard's possible strategies in his mid-tier law school. He might have learned a few if he'd attended one of the Ivies and been inducted into certain secret societies. Fenkom raised the wand the other men couldn't see and spoke into the puppy skull at the top, casting a spell to detect magic, just to be sure the young lawyer wasn't any more impressive than he seemed. He looked around quickly through his magic monocle. Nothing in the room, including the young lawyer, gave off any warning glows. I'm sorry, what was that, sir? The CFO asked. The CEO cringed. He hated it when his brother said, I'm sorry, when he didn't hear people, or excuse me, when he burped. The CEO had successfully eradicated any vocabulary that might be mistaken for an apology from his vocabulary, just as completely as the swear words he'd been forbidden as a child, and his brother's lapses into the language of weakness, even when it came out unconsciously and without any real intention, reminded the CEO why his brother was not his favorite output machine of his 7 siblings. Oh, I was just saying other words so I wouldn't curse, the wizard only half lied. His voice slowly rose to a shout. Like, how did these 2 poop-for-brains, gosh-darn turds manage to fudge this up so fudging royally? It worked every time before, sir, the CEO said without apologizing. We take the store. We threaten to sue. They go away. We sell the store to someone else. We wait. Rinse. Repeat. A money-printing machine. That's how I think of it anyway. All output. Until they don't go away, Rich said. My legal opinion is that an illegal scheme is doomed to eventually be deemed illegal when it gets in front of a judge or jury. That's the way it's supposed to work. But why now? The CFO whined, his voice taking on a particularly grating nasal pitch. Everything was going so well. Rich looked at his yellow legal pad as though reading something written there, and even placed little tick marks to accentuate the list he hadn't written. Let's see. Sympathetic victim. Highly engaged fan base. Crowdfunding for legal fees. An entertaining YouTube documentary. A media pylon. Oh, and animal cruelty. Fenkom frowned. Animal cruelty? The store had a pet bird. Chris and her husband, what's his name, couldn't take it because it belonged to the store. And then the bird disappeared, and some people are really mad about that. I went on TV and said the dumb bird was taken to a no-kill shelter, and I thought that would be the end of it, but... What really happened to the bird? We don't, the CEO started. Silent Brant probably killed it, the CFO admitted. Heck, Shoeless John might have bit its head off. They're criminals. He looked at his brother. You hire criminals. You're going to make Billy into the kind of person who bites the head off of birds like that rock and roller. Bats, Rich said, and didn't elaborate. Who's Billy? Finkham asked. He's the executive project manager, the CFO said. Just a low-level employee, the CEO said. Finkham shook his head. I don't care about Billy or the bird. Look, you had two simple jobs. Keep my identity a secret and keep laundering money through your whatever. Toy stores or insurance scams or tax fraud, I don't care. As long as my name stays out of it and the money remains available for my use. He bent down and picked up the little pink pad of Post-its, then stepped toward the CEO's desk and slapped it down. It made a very different noise when he did it. When Finkham pulled his hand away, a gold coin sat in the exact center of the cleared mahogany surface, hammered down so hard it had left a half-moon dent in the imported tropical hardwood. I don't need your money. I need my money turned into those little digital ones and zeros you people use now. But you couldn't just be happy stealing some of it off the top from me. Yes, I know about that. The CEO shook his head. No, I wouldn't say we were stealing. Those were appropriate fees, and I can email you a list of all of those. Oh, you'll email me a list, will you? When, exactly? Today. I could email that right now. He looked at the tower of his computer lying on its side next to his desk, his keyboard on the other side, a few loose keys mixed in with the pile of papers in the middle of the room, his thin monitor, a dark rectangle near the window. The death of the monitor had been even more disappointing than the Post-its. He wanted a huge smash of broken glass. The LCD display had just turned off, and the plastic barely cracked. The CEO didn't know enough about computers to know if his email account was in the boxy part or in the disappointing plastic TV part. Or tomorrow. Maybe this coming Wednesday at the latest. Stuff it. I don't care about the embezzlement. No, it's not. Shut up and listen, you buffoon. You aren't good at embezzling. You aren't good at any of this. But you better get very good at hiding my identity, because if anyone finds me through the two of you, I will have you eaten alive by pigs. He spun on Rich. And of course that's a metaphor you do not need to report, unless you also want to be eaten by pigs, figuratively. Of course, Rich said, metaphors fall under lawyer-client privilege. Good. Finkham turned back to the CEO and CFO. Make this go away. I don't care what you have to do. He pointed his wand at the CEO's face. It was only 8 inches long, and he held it in the middle, so while the wand was perfectly effective and more practical for travel than the staff he used back in the lair, this travel wand looked even less intimidating than his golf shirt and khaki shorts. But they couldn't see the wand. He just looked like he was pointing in a strange way, his fist mostly closed, the tip of his thumb aimed at the CEO's nose. But the wizard's unshakable confidence and seething menace cowed even the CEO. Don't fudge this up. You know what I did to your father when he let me down. Then he spun so the robes they couldn't see swirled out around him, and he stomped out the door, down the hall, across the lobby, and into the elevator, his puppy familiar running along behind him. Then Finkham teleported back to South Dakota. The CEO stood up but remained silent for a moment, then picked up the gold coin on his desk. It had writing on one side in a language he didn't recognize, and on the other an image of a skull drinking out of a flask. Some part of his mind knew anything purchased with such a coin would turn poisonous. Another part of his mind rejected that, and he stuck the coin in his pants pocket. I have an idea, the CFO said. Maybe we can get Chris and her husband, what's his name, arrested. They can't sue us if they're in jail, right? Rich resisted the urge to roll his eyes. They would be far less credible witnesses if they were convicted of something, but I am obligated to inform you that willfully and knowingly filing a false police report is a crime. If it causes an emergency response, that's a felony, but even if it doesn't, it can be a misdemeanor that can carry up to a year in jail. Thanks, Dick, the CEO said. Okay, so no writing this down or emailing about it or talking about it on camera. Got it. What could we get them for? I can't engage in that, Rich said. It's okay, the CFO said. I know a detective at the police department who will work with us on that. She can always think of some charge. Call her. Let's not end up as pig food. Rich raised a hand like a child in school, but didn't wait to be called upon. Just out of curiosity, what did he do to your father? He replaced him, the CEO said. With us, the CFO added. The young lawyer breathed out a nearly silent phew and muttered, "Insult to injury. Brutal." The CEO and CFO misunderstood this and nodded, then went back to their plotting. In South Dakota, Fenkum arrived in the foyer of the cave lair. The vista behind him had been a vast open expanse of lowland, dotted with scrub brush turning into forest in the distance. But now, the large arched aluminum Quonset hut filled up most of the space, standing just a dozen yards from the cave's entrance. Its sides were elevated on top of cinder-block walls. It looked like it could have housed a medium-sized private aircraft. But there was no runway, just the dirt road created by the construction vehicles. Some of the workers probably assumed a runway would follow. When the construction of the hut was complete, he'd invited them all to a lavish party with kegs of beer and enough snacks for 3 times as many men. That had ensured they would all show up. Then he'd turned them all to ash with a single series of fireballs and served the chips and beer to the swinemen in the cave. As he entered now, 2 of the swinemen sniffed hopefully before slumping back against the walls, disappointed. It reminded Fenkum it had been too long since the beer and snacks. At some point, they would get hungry enough, and were stupid enough, that one of them would try to take a bite out of him. The wizard reached out into one of the long sleeves of his robe and pulled out bag after bag of potato chips, tossing them dismissively at the feet of the swinemen. The large creatures scrambled up to nearly human squatting positions and snatched the bags, slapping at one another as each tried to take 2. Fenkum left the naturally hewn portion of the cave and entered his own lair, with its polished walls and hardwood floor, a library of bookshelves and work tables, and storage for assorted ingredients. The anhanas, he noted, were still in their cages. He assumed they'd made some attempt to escape in his absence, but hadn't figured out how to affect the bars that would burn them at the slightest touch. The middle of the room had a new kind of emptiness. For generations of humans, it had only possessed a single crate, wooden and ancient, dating back to before any other European had visited this land. On the orders of his employers, he'd set out hundreds of years before Columbus, before any European made maps he could use, on a boat not designed for the open ocean, his own magical abilities carrying him to the other side of a world he could barely believe was a sphere, to where he found the last ingredient. Of course, the Amazon rainforest didn't have a Greek name when he arrived, but there he acquired what he needed in true European fashion, purchasing it with shiny poison that quickly eradicated the whole tribe of traders who sold it to him. He placed the object in that shiny new trunk, surrounded by the softest materials he could find, and brought it all the way to what would someday be upstate New York. And there, from his first lair in the woods, he did his employer's bidding. Small tasks, mostly. The Europeans came, as his employers had promised. He just had to do some occasional poisoning and slaughtering to help them get a foothold. He failed miserably in Roanoke, but learned some valuable lessons about the protective spirits of the new land. Some of these spirits, like the ladies and lords of the Great Lakes, he avoided. Some, like the long-horned wyverns of the Rockies, he hunted. But mostly, the colonists did it on their own. They'd been told they had a destiny, after all. They just had to manifest it. When a group of warriors from the Oglala Lakota were chased into this particular cave by the Union Army, he followed them, slaughtered them, and discovered a home the rest of the country would not notice until his work was done. He interacted with the world as indirectly as he could, using intermediaries, like the boobs at MegaCorp, and their father before them. And the thing in the box grew. It grew so slowly at first. Decades went by and it still fit in the palm of his hand. But the growth was exponential. Just 100 years ago, he'd had to take it out of the crate, now old and decayed, but still strong enough to break the fragile ingredient. He kept the old box for sentimental reasons, still there in the center of the room for as long as he could. The growing object moved into a corner. He set the last ingredient in a nest of blankets, and then styrofoam angel poop, once that had been invented. And it remained there, growing, while its former box held the pride of place as the room's sole aesthetic decoration. And then, just months ago, when the ingredient was nearly as large as the mouth of the cave, he'd moved it into the new Quonset hut he'd had built. He had to slide the old crate out of the way as he carefully levitated the giant fragile object across the room to the door, and the old chest couldn't take the strain. It had cracked once, then crumpled under its own weight. He did his best to ignore it while he focused on floating the ingredient to its new home. When he'd come back and seen the wreckage of the crate, Fenkum had been filled with fury. He kicked at it, stomped on it, until it was splinters and strips of rotten leather. The Anhanas had watched, uncomprehending. They couldn't possibly fathom what that box symbolized. Hundreds of years dedicated to one task. Like that old box, Fenkum himself had nearly fulfilled his purpose. And, like that old box, when he was finished, when the ingredient was finished, when the entire curse was complete and unbreakable, Fenkum would be nothing but a broken shell as well. Used and used up and useless. It would all be for nothing. And that was the point. He relished it and hated it, felt pride at his commitment and hated himself for his dedication to it, resented his employers and worshipped them for the perfect purity of the calling they'd given him. And out in the Quonset hut, the egg continued to grow. Soon it would hatch. He didn't know how soon. As long as those fudging morons at MegaCorp didn't tip off any knights errant, it would come out of the soft, membranous shell, and then there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcasting app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider becoming a member of my Substack or Patreon. Thanks to my newest Substack subscribers, Annie Melissa, Central Florida Carpenter, Still Ill, and Kai Kai, and thanks to the 12,378 of you who now subscribe to my channel on YouTube. That still just boggles my mind. So glad you're here. I like to give shout-outs to fellow creators. So if you're a Patreon patron or a Substack member or YouTube subscriber and you have a book or some other project for me to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com and I'll mention it here on the show. Speaking of which, I mentioned this episode's sponsor, but I didn't tell you anything about illustrator Cyan and author Hydra Corvey's book, The Upside Down Sea. Bianco, a great white shork, is a tireless adventurer and globetrotter. However, one place remains inaccessible to him, the Upside Down Sea, the sea in the sky. Bianco can see fish there, and waterfalls from it. It must be a sea, but a shork, however strong, will have a hard time reaching the sky on its own. How will Bianco reach the Upside Down Sea, and what surprises await him up there? Check out this bilingual book, text in French and English, illustrated with 80 full-color pages. There's a link to that book in the show notes. See you back here for Chapter 27 of Brick by Brick. Teaser: we don't know how MegaCorp will respond to this week's revelations, but maybe a witch can force the ghost of a voodoo priestess to spill the beans about the connection between the evil wizard Fenkum and the companies he operates.